This is the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 21, and here's an old new theme song. For this week's episode, we're going to discuss the critical period in human history surrounding the year 1921 and what it means for depth mysticism. With me, as always, Jungian depth mystic Zach Tolan. Well, hello. 1921. That is a pretty important year. That's the year Carl Jung came out with his book, Psychological Types. Yes, that's part of why it's such an interesting year. But we're going to need a lot of context, I think, in order to explain why it matters so much. I think we can go straight into the content of Jung's types because he pretty much explains what the big deal is. But maybe we should also cover a few other things that happened around the year 1921 that Joseph Campbell thought were a big deal. Okay, so Joseph Campbell mentions 3 other books besides Jung's Psychological Types. One is Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, which is a good and important book. He talks about the personality of civilizations, the character of civilizations, talking about the Gothic civilization of Western Europe, which he calls Faustian. That would be our Western civilization. Then he has the Magian, and he has the Egyptian, and he has a bunch of different civilizational characters, and you can see the character in the buildings, but also in the literature, the different cultures in general. That's a really important bird's eye view of human civilization that is a necessary thing in modern times. Yes, and what else happened in 1921? Well, James Joyce published Ulysses around that time. And Ulysses is maybe the boldest literary achievement, perhaps, of the 20th century. Although there's a lot of literary achievements. I'm not an English professor, so I'm not in a position to defend that statement completely, but it's a big deal. You know, James Joyce's Ulysses. And Joseph Campbell also mentions Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which is a less popular novel. But it's good, and you could consider it important. Okay, but let's try to get at what it was about this period. What's the big deal? What's really the big deal? Well, I would say that Carl Jung is the most adequate summarizer of why it's a big deal in his book, Psychological Types, because he talks about psychology being present all throughout history, but nobody could identify it as psychology. What we talked about in the episode on the collective unconscious, Carl Jung starts pointing out that the collective unconscious had always been active among people, and that actually prevented them from achieving a scientific perspective on anything that they were doing. The psyche was always more powerful than the people. Now, if that's the case, then one would wonder why it is that in 1921, Jung claims that there is some kind of possibility of an objective science of psychology. How is it magically in the 20th century people became capable of getting outside themselves and seeing themselves for what they truly were, whereas in all historical periods before, they were the victims of their own psyches or subjected to the power of the psyche? Well, that's a good question. Everybody likes to think of their own era as perhaps the most enlightened era. So that's a natural impulse in humanity to think that we can get outside ourselves. But I guess each person who says that they understand what's going on will have to make their own case. And the question here is, what is the case for 1921 being the beginning of a new era? The moment at which humanity got sufficiently outside of itself to activate a whole new way of seeing. That is what Jung's book, Psychological Types, begins to discuss, that issue. Because Jung's theory of types actually gives an explanation for Christian psychology. And his theory of types is somewhat scientific. It's not totally scientific. It's not reliably testable in every way. But it is a theory that has to do with forces and balancing and opposition between forces. Like if you go too far one way, you have to come back, like a pendulum. And so Jung's worldview is a lot more like physics than any religion before it. And from his point of view, the mind can get into positions of extremes and require compensation from its opposite. Just like if a thing goes up, it must come down. But equally so, at least in Jung psychology, if a thing goes down, it must come up. Is that the opposites always will activate a counter position, which then asserts itself. And you can see this simple fact in dreams, which are representations of the unconscious psyche, which seems to have a kind of consciousness of its own. The conscious psyche could never have come up with the dream. The dream appears to a person as if it's from something other than one's conscious self. And Jung and Freud, they call that the unconscious. And it seems to have a life of its own. But generally speaking, it's this compensating opposite. What comes up must come down. If you went too far in one direction in your conscious life, then the unconscious will produce a dream that explains to you the supplemental or missing elements from your consciousness. Jung is saying that all throughout history, this phenomenon has been occurring, but it's only starting to be known as such in Jungian psychology. Maybe it was seen in alchemy. Jung later spent many decades studying alchemy because he realized that it was a precursor to his psychology. And in alchemy, the same phenomenon applies. There are opposites, the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and there are many attempts to balance the opposites But this is a new perspective on what the hell's been going on the whole time. In religion, especially in Western religion, there's a lot of extremes. It's like the one God insists on his oneness as his one and only ness. And that always is going to set you up for an extreme situation because people experience the world as multitudes, as many different things. We experience the world as having many things. So any religions that set themselves up as the one true God are going to activate a counter position somewhere. And this worldview, it first comes to full flowering in Jung's book, Psychological Types, in 1921. And the claim is that beforehand, humanity was too caught up in its psychological projections to be able to see these opposites, that people take these positions and then they get opposed by a counterposition from the unconscious. Okay, it seems like we're diving into some really interesting territory. It does seem a little vague, which is somewhat understandable given how big a subject it is. It's not like we're just talking about one thing here. We're talking about a kind of phenomenon that purportedly has been plaguing or at least saturating human affairs forever. And only in the 20th century was observed in the way that Jungian psychology observes it. Yep, that's true. And fortunately, the subject matter being so big, the rest of the book, Psychological Types, does focus in on some things that people can relate to in a smaller way. Most of the book on types focuses on introverts and extroverts, the introverted worldview and the extroverted worldview. It's only trying to articulate a single idea. The idea that the whole world is waking up from some kind of dream, that we finally have access to a greater overall consciousness, cannot be swallowed as such because there's too much to think about. So it's nice if we can focus in on one specific aspect of humanity, in particular, noticing that these types exist and that there have been people throughout history who have preferred one type or the other. You can say something very abstract and mystical, but if you also give people a practical truth, like there were extroverts and there were introverts, they're real, you're basically born with it, and it totally affects how people see the world. If you give them that basic beginning, then it can really help. You don't necessarily need to know the whole history of Christianity or of world religion or of civilization just to learn this one thing about people in your actual life. I know, admittedly, it is good to have specific ideas that people can grasp onto, especially that apply directly in their own lives without them needing to know any knowledge of history at all. But still, reading Carl Jung is hard. It's not just a simple matter of being told what's what. When you're reading him, he's always referencing all of history. You're saying he's doing a good thing by making it somewhat simple, or at least a little easier. But I would contend that the way he presents it is still including all sorts of references from history. It's a really broad picture, and so I would dispute that Jung's making it easy for people. He's doing both. He's simultaneously offering a set of practical ideas that apply to everyone's life in terms of these psychological types. But he's also presenting world history. He's explaining the existence of these types in many different centuries. He's describing the history of civilization and the application of these types in that history. Exactly. And moreover, he's laying claim to religion. in his description of the types. He's saying that the things that have happened in religion are actually expressions of the different psychological functions and their relationships with each other. Some people would call that psychologizing religion. Or if you see psychology as a science, then he's doing a scientific explanation of religion, and a lot of people would get offended by that. Yes, that is a huge part of the scandal of Jungian psychology. It's this realization that the scientific revolution, which began in the 1500s and created all sorts of subsequent historical and technological phenomena, the scientific revolution, the idea that this scientific revolution has an important invasion to perform on religion. Back in the Middle Ages, it was heretical to question the authority of the church. And religion laid claim to large aspects of people's minds and their lives. And the idea that science would invade that has been controversial for a long time. And so when Carl Jung does it with psychology, when anyone does it with psychology, it retains that controversial situation. But I would argue that Jung does it better than anybody else. Jung actually understands the situation far better than most scientists who try to study religion. And the book Psychological Types, it's the opposite of a narrow discussion of just one aspect of human psychology. It is a description of a phenomenon that has occurred throughout history, an explanation of a lot of history from the lens of that phenomenon. He explains large parts of Christianity by means of the science of psychology, or at least of his psychology. But he does a good job of it. That's my point. That's why Jung is such a big deal. He's not just a trivial scientist who is out to debunk things and make little of the history of religion. When Jung takes on religion, he's not belittling it. He respects it in a way that I think religious people should respect about Carl Jung. That's the reason Jung is a big deal. It's because when Jung finds a way to perceive religion from the perspective of science, he does it with the most comprehensive and respectful attitude towards religion of anybody. You could argue he's more respectful of religion than most religious people are, who seem to live in their own shadows much more frequently. Most religions have some kind of shadow where there's this aspect of it that they don't discuss, that they don't really want to acknowledge, that they feel totally uncomfortable indulging in. And that discredits their religion insofar as they can't deal with certain aspects of reality. And in that sense, they are not what they are even aspiring to be as religious figures. Their public image is of devotion to their religious truth. Insofar as they can't handle certain things, then they're failing in that mission. And that's what I'm saying Jung succeeds at. He's able to retain consciousness in the face of the shadow more successfully. And yes, that does degrade the value of their religion, but that's been happening for a long time. Religion has had a lot of holes in it. It's almost like Swiss cheese. My point is that Jung is more comprehensive than most religious people. I'll just say it. And that's why the Jungian era, which began around 1921 with the book Psychological Types, is so important. Because in a way, it really is a whole new religion. It might not have the participatory characteristics that a lot of religions have. When we think of religion, we think of the kind of thing that anyone can just convert to and join. We think they have an open door and anyone can just come in and not know anything and convert to that religion. I don't think Jungian psychology has that characteristic. I don't think anybody can just walk in the door and convert to Jungian psychology. It requires a full consciousness, a much more highly developed ego, what they call ego. But it is kind of like a religion. And even Jungians don't even know why it's like a religion. They don't even know exactly what aspects of Jungian psychology compare directly to what we think of as religion. That's why they're loath to refer to it as a religion. Because it's kind of like a scientific religion. It is like the best effort and probably the only thing we really need in the end in order to stand in as the synthesis of science and religion. That's the big holy grail. Can religion see science fairly and incorporate it? And can science see religion fairly and incorporate it? And that's what the new era that began in 1921, in the wake of World War I, so it's like Western civilization did commit a kind of self-crucifixion in an effort to hypothetically do something. And Jungian psychology is something. It is the best synthesis of science and religion that I think we're going to find, and it's probably the one that we need. We might not need more than that. So that's why the new era that started at that time is such a big deal. Well, okay. I mean, that's a pretty good point. And that'll do it. Make a comment in our discussion groups, which are listed in the description. And we will see you next week.